Welcome, friends, to Wild Cowboy Tales. This is the place where the dust of the trail meets the fire of the heart, where legends are forged in gunpowder and grit. If you enjoy stories of the untamed West, of lonesome riders, and the hard price of justice, I ask that you reach down and click that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it helps us keep these tales alive, stoking the campfire for all who wander this digital frontier. Now, settle in. The night is drawing close, and the coyotes are singing their lonesome song. It's the perfect time for a story. A story about a man who wore the badge of a Texas Ranger, and the bitter trail he rode when honor was betrayed. He rode with the Texas Rangers once, now he hunts them one by one. The sun over the Chihuahuan Desert was a merciless anvil, and the heat that hammered down upon the five riders was as solid and unyielding as iron. Sergeant Elias Vance, Eli to his friends, felt it pressing on his hat, warming the worn leather of his saddle, and baking the very air he breathed. But his gaze, clear and blue as a mountain lake, was fixed on the shimmering horizon, his focus as sharp as the edge of his bowie knife. He was a Texas Ranger, and this heat, this unforgiving landscape, was his home and his crucible. Eli was the kind of man the West both created and feared. He was tall in the saddle, with a lean, hard frame built not by ease but by endless miles and scarce meals. His face was a map of his life, tanned by the sun, with lines etched around his eyes from squinting into its glare and a firm set to his jaw that spoke of a resolve that did not bend easily. He was quiet by nature, his words chosen as carefully as his shots. Among the company of rangers, he was known for his uncanny ability to read the land, to see a story in a single broken twig or an overturned stone. He could track a ghost through a sandstorm, and his aim with the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip was the stuff of campfire legend. His comrades trusted him with their lives, for he had proven time and again that he valued their lives more than his own. Riding at his side was Jedediah Stone Jed, a man whose laughter was as loud and frequent as his gun was fast. Jed and Eli had joined the Rangers together, two young men full of fire and a belief in the simple clarity of the law. They were closer than brothers, an unspoken understanding passing between them in a shared glance or a subtle nod. On Ellie's other side was Deacon Croft, a man whose solemn, church-going demeanor masked a ferocity in a firefight that was second to none. His rifle, a .73 Winchester, was an extension of his will, and he used it with the conviction of a preacher saving souls. Leading them all was Captain Marcus Thorne, a veteran of countless skirmishes and pursuits. Thorne was a titan of a man, with a thick graying mustache and a voice that could cut through a saloon brawl like a cannon blast. He was more than their commander, he was their mentor. He had taught Eli how to read a man's intentions in his eyes, and how to survive when the world wanted him dead. Eli revered him, seeing in Thorne the very embodiment of the Ranger creed: courage, honor, and an unwavering dedication to justice. Their current quarry was the Crimson Coyotes, a gang of outlaws led by the ruthless Silas Kane. They were more than thieves, they were butchers who had left a trail of burned ranches and murdered families from the Pecos to the Rio Grande. For 2 long, grueling weeks, Eli and his company had tracked them, living on jerky and grit, sleeping under a blanket of stars with one eye open. It was Ellie's tracking that had finally led them here, to a labyrinthine network of canyons known as Outlaws. Intelligence, bought with Ranger gold, suggested Kane and his men were holed up in an old, abandoned silver mine, guarding a fortune in stolen bullion. "He's in there, Captain," Eli said, his voice low and raspy from the dust. He pointed with his chin toward a narrow opening in the rock face, a dark slash against the ochre stone. "Tracks of at least a dozen men and laden mules. They went in, but they haven't come out." Captain Thorne shielded his eyes, his gaze sweeping the canyon walls. "Good work, Sergeant. Your eyes are as sharp as ever." He turned in his saddle, addressing the 24 Rangers arrayed behind him. "This is it, boys. Kane's been a plague on this land for too long. We go in, we root him out, and we bring him back to hang. Justice has a long memory, and today, we are its instrument." A quiet murmur of assent rolled through the men. They dismounted, the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather filling the hot, still air. The plan was simple, a classic Ranger maneuver Thorne himself had perfected. They would split into 3 teams. Thorne would lead the main assault through the mine entrance. Jed would take a second team up and around, covering a high ridge to pin the outlaws down from above. Allie's team, the smallest and fastest, would circle to a secondary ventilation shaft he had spotted, cutting off any escape. As they prepared their weapons, checking cylinders, and loading rifles, a strange feeling pricked at the back of Ellie's neck. He saw Deacon Croft exchange a quick, almost imperceptible glance with one of Thorne's most trusted men, a ranger named Corrigan. It was nothing, a flicker, but it was out of place. He dismissed it as a trick of the heat, the fatigue of the long chase playing on his nerves. "Be safe, brother," Jed said, clapping Eli on the shoulder. His grin was wide and confident. "Leave a few for me." "Always do," Eli replied, returning the gesture. The bond between them was a rock in the shifting sands of the frontier. Eli led his 4 men on a swift, silent trek along the canyon floor, their boots making soft sounds in the deep red dust. They moved with the economy of motion born of long practice, their bodies low, their eyes scanning the rocks above. The air grew hotter, trapped between the high stone walls. They found the ventilation shaft, a dark, narrow hole hidden behind a screen of thorny mesquite. It was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "This is our door," Eli whispered. "We go in quiet. No shooting unless you have to. Our job is to be the wall they run into when the captain flushes them out." His men nodded, their faces grim and determined. One by one, they slipped into the darkness of the earth. The shaft descended steeply, the air growing thick with the smell of damp stone and stale gunpowder. It was a tight, claustrophobic squeeze, their shoulders scraping against the rough-hewn rock. After what felt like an eternity, the shaft opened into a larger tunnel, a side passage of the main mine. Faintly, from the direction of the main entrance, they heard the first echoes of gunfire. "Right on time," Eli breathed. "Let's move." They advanced through the suffocating blackness, their hands trailing along the cold, damp walls. The sounds of the battle grew louder, the sharp crack of pistols, the deeper boom of rifles, the shouts of men. They were getting closer. Eli held up a hand, halting his team at a junction where their tunnel met a much larger one. A flickering light danced from around the corner. Peeking cautiously, Eli saw a scene from hell. The main cavern of the mine was lit by a half-dozen lanterns, their yellow glow illuminating a maelstrom of violence. The Crimson Coyotes, caught by surprise, were putting up a desperate fight. But something was terribly wrong. He saw Captain Thorne, not leading the charge, but standing near the back with Deacon Croft and a handful of his men, directing fire not just at the Outlaws, but also at his own rangers, ones who weren't part of his inner circle. Eli watched in horror as a young ranger, a kid named Billy who had just joined the company, was cut down, not by an outlaw's bullet, but by a blast from Corrigan's shotgun. The world seemed to slow down, the thunder of the guns fading to a dull roar in Ellie's ears. Betrayal. The word slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a raid. It was a massacre. An extermination. Before he could process the treachery, Silas Kane, the coyote leader, emerged from behind a stack of crates, his hands raised. "Thorne, we had a deal," he screamed over the din. Captain Thorne raised his pistol, his face a cold and readable mask. "The deal has changed, Silas." He fired once. Kane crumpled to the ground. The outlaws, their leader dead, began to surrender, throwing down their weapons. But Thorne's men showed no mercy. They walked forward, executing the wounded and the surrendering with cold, methodical precision. And then Eli saw a reason for the slaughter. Stacked against the far wall of the cavern were dozens of wooden chests. One of them splintered open, revealing the dull, heavy gleam of gold bullion. This was never about justice. It was about greed. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over Eli. His entire world, the code he had lived by, the men he had trusted, had been a lie. "Sergeant," one of his men whispered, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" Eli didn't have an answer. He only knew he had to stop it. He raised his Colt, the weight of it familiar and steadying in his hand. He was about to step out, to confront Thorne, to demand an answer for this unforgivable sin, when a new sound echoed from above, a sharp report of a sniper's rifle. One of Thorne's men near the mine entrance spun and fell. Then another. Ellie's eyes shot towards the high ridge where Jed was supposed to be. It was him. Jed was still loyal. A desperate spark of hope ignited in Ellie's chest. They weren't all traitors. Thorne and his men scrambled for cover, firing wildly up at the ridge. "Stone!" Thorne bellowed, his voice a roar of fury. "You damned, righteous fool!" "It's Jed," Eli hissed to his men. He's with us. We have to help him. He broke from their cover, his peacemaker bucking in his hand, his first shot taking one of the traitors in the shoulder. His men followed his lead, their own guns erupting in the confined space. For a moment, the traitors were caught in a crossfire, confused and panicked. But they were outnumbered. Deacon Croft, his face twisted in a snarl that belied his holy nickname, organized the traitors, directing their fire toward Ellie's position. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. One of Ellie's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg. "Fall back," Eli yelled, dragging the wounded man with him. They retreated back into the narrow tunnel, the darkness swallowing them once more. The sounds of Jed's rifle from above suddenly went silent. A cold dread, heavier than any stone, settled in Ellie's gut. "Jed!" he screamed, his voice raw. There was no answer but the echoing gunfire. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that Jed was gone. He was alone. His captain, his brothers, his very life as a ranger, all of it had been a mirage. Now, there was only the suffocating dark of the mine and the stench of betrayal. He had to get his remaining men out. They scrambled back the way they came, the wounded ranger groaning with every movement. When they reached the ventilation shaft, the searing light of the afternoon was a shock to their eyes. As Eli helped his last man through the opening, a volley of shots erupted from the main entrance of the mine. They knew he was here. "Go," Eli commanded his men. "Get to the horses. Ride east and don't look back. Tell them what Thorne did. Tell them everything. But, Sergeant, that's an order. Go." He laid down, covering fire, his shots precise and deliberate, forcing the traitors to keep their heads down. He saw Thorne's face, contorted with rage, appear for a second at the mouth of the cave. Their eyes met across the 100 yards of sun-baked rock. In that instant, an unspoken declaration of war passed between them. Eli turned and ran, not towards the horses, but deeper into the canyon's embrace. He was a ghost now, a target. They would hunt him. He had to disappear. He scrambled up the rocky inclines, his lungs burning, his heart a block of ice in his chest. He had lost everything: his friends, his honor, his name. The rangers would brand him a traitor, a story Thorne would surely concoct, painting Eli as the one who made a deal with the coyotes. He ran until his legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a weathered sandstone spire as twilight began to bleed purple and orange across the sky. He was miles from the mine, but the sounds of the massacre still rang in his ears. He was wounded, a bullet having grazed his arm, but he barely felt the sting. The pain in his soul was a far greater agony. As the first stars began to prick the velvet darkness, Eli pushed himself to his feet. He looked back in the direction of Diablo's Maw, a place where his life had been irrevocably shattered. The man he was, Sergeant Elias Vance of the Texas Rangers, had died in that mine. He stood on that lonely hill as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the desert floor. The cool night air did nothing to chill the fire that had begun to burn within him. It was a cold, clean fire. A fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at his hands, which had once upheld the law. Now, they would become its executioners. He thought of Jed, of young Billy, of the honor of the badge Thorne had desecrated with innocent blood. The first rays of dawn found him still standing there, a solitary figure etched against the vast, indifferent landscape. The warmth of the rising sun touched his face, but his eyes were chips of blue ice. The shadow of the ranger had vanished, consumed by the darkness of his new purpose. He was no longer a lawman. He was a reckoning. And he would hunt them. He would hunt them all, one by one. The desert became his sanctuary and his tormentor. For days that blurred into a sleepless, sun-scorched nightmare, Eli moved through the vast, empty expanse. He traveled by night, guided by the cold, distant light of the stars, and hid during the day, finding shelter from the oppressive heat in shallow caves or beneath the sparse shade of a skeletal Palo Verde tree. He moved like an animal, driven by pure instinct. The pain in his arm was a dull, constant throb, a physical reminder of the deeper wound in his soul. He had torn a strip from his shirt to bind it, but the wound was beginning to fester in the relentless heat. Water was a constant, desperate obsession. He found it in hidden seeps at the base of cliffs, his cracked lips pressing against the damp rock to suckle the precious, life-giving moisture. He ate what the desert offered, the bitter fruit of a prickly pear cactus, a lizard he managed to snatch with a desperate lunge. The ranger who had been known for his meticulous preparation was gone, stripped down to the raw essence of survival. The desert was burning away the man he had been, forging something harder, something more dangerous in its place. His mind was a maelstrom of fractured images: Jed's laughing face, Captain Thorne's look of cold fury, the glint of gold in the lantern light, the fall of a good young ranger. The betrayal churned in his gut, a venom that fueled him when his body screamed to give up. Thorne had not only murdered his friends and stolen his honor, he had poisoned his past. Every memory of camaraderie, every shared joke around a campfire, every moment of pride in the badge was now tainted, twisted into a cruel mockery. After a week of this agonizing pilgrimage, his path led him toward a thin, dark plume of smoke rising against the pale blue sky. Caution, ingrained by years as a ranger, warred with a desperate, human need for contact. He approached slowly, using the terrain for cover, his hand never far from the butt of his Colt. As he crested a low rise, the source of the smoke came into view, and the cold dread that had been his constant companion since the mine coalesced into a familiar, sickening horror. It was a small, isolated homestead, or what was left of it. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, its timbers blackened and collapsed. The corral fence was splintered, and the bodies of 2 horses lay where they had been shot. He moved closer, the smell of burnt pine and something else, something sickeningly sweet, filling the air. He found the family near the remains of a small vegetable garden. A man, a woman, and a small child, no older than 5. They hadn't been killed by the fire. They had been executed. The scene was a brutal echo of the stories he'd heard about the Crimson Coyotes. But it was a small detail that made his blood run cold. Near the man's body, half pressed into the dusty ground, was a single, spent cartridge. A .44-40, the kind used in a Winchester 73 rifle. The kind Deacon Croft favored. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. Thorne and his traders hadn't just ridden away with the gold. They had continued their bloody charade. They were using the guise of the Crimson Coyotes to continue their reign of terror, to plunder and murder, hiding their crimes behind the reputation of the outlaws they had exterminated. This family hadn't been killed by Silas Kane's men. They had been murdered by Texas Rangers. He stumbled away from the horrific scene, a ragged cry of anguish tearing from his throat. He fell to his knees, his fists beating against the hard, unforgiving earth until his knuckles were wry and bleeding. This was the consequence of Thorne's betrayal. It wasn't just about a stolen reputation or a fortune in gold. It was about the innocent people who were paying the price for his greed, people the Rangers were sworn to protect. He found the body of another man 100 yards from the cabin, hidden in a shallow arroyo. The man was dressed in the familiar trousers and worn shirt of a ranger. It was Sam Pickett, one of the men who had been with Jed's team on the ridge. He'd been shot in the back. Eli realized with a chilling clarity that Sam must have survived the initial betrayal and followed the traitors, perhaps hoping to find a moment to exact his own justice, only to be discovered and cut down. He had died alone, a witness to the very evil he had sworn to fight. Eli knelt beside the fallen ranger, his brother in arms, and gently closed the man's unseeing eyes. He took the time to dig a shallow grave in the rocky soil, his bare hands scraping against stone and thorns. It was a slow, painful process, a final act of respect for a man who deserved so much more. As he worked, a cold, hard resolve began to solidify within him, displacing the chaotic grief and rage. Vengeance was no longer just a personal desire. It was a sacred duty. A duty to Jed, to young Billy, to Sam Pickett, and to the murdered family whose names he would never know. He finished the grave, marking it with a small cross made from 2 lashed pieces of mesquite. He stood there for a long time as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. The world was quiet, the only sound the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. In that profound silence, his purpose became clear. He walked to the smoldering ruins of the cabin, the ashes still warm beneath his boots. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the small leather pouch where he had instinctively shoved his ranger badge. He opened it, and the silver star lay tarnished and dull in his palm. It had once been his symbol of honor, of everything he believed in. Now, it was a relic of a dead life, a reminder of a sacred trust that had been shattered. He looked from the badge to the ashes, to the lonely grave on the hillside. He thought of Thorne, of Deacon Croft, of Corrigan, and the others. Their faces swam in his mind, no longer brothers, but monsters cloaked in the guise of lawmen. They had made their choice in that dark mine. Now, he would make his. I swear it, he whispered, his voice a raw, grating sound in the twilight. He spoke the words to the ghosts that surrounded him, to the vast and silent land that bore witness to his oath. I swear on your memory, Sam. On yours, Jed. I swear it on the souls of this family. I will not rest until every last one of them has paid. They cast me out, called me a traitor. So, I will be what they made me. I will be the shadow that haunts their steps. I will be the fear in their hearts. They will know my name before they die. They will know that justice has come for them. His voice grew stronger, the words a litany, a prayer of damnation. One by one, I will hunt them. I will find them in their fortified towns and their lonely hideouts. I will strip away their stolen gold and their false honor. I will deliver the justice they denied to others. This is my vow. He closed his hand around the badge, the points of the star digging into his palm. He did not put it away. Instead, he took a strip of leather from his saddlebag and tied the badge to the hilt of his bowie knife. It would serve as a constant, tangible reminder of his purpose, a union of what he had been and what he must now become. The law and the blade, now instruments of a singular, deadly mission. He rummaged through Sam Pickett's saddlebags, finding a spare canteen of water, a few strips of dried meat, and, most importantly, a box of ammunition. It felt ghoulish, but it was necessary. Survival was paramount. His vengeance required him to live. As full darkness fell, he stood before the ruins one last time. He was no longer running. He was no longer a victim. The fire of his grief had been banked and forged into something cold and sharp, like tempered steel. He put his hat on his head, the familiar weight a small comfort in a world turned upside heels. He checked his Colt, the smooth, worn grips fitting perfectly in his hand. He slid the bowie knife, now adorned with its silver star, back into its sheath. He turned his back on the ashes and the graves and began to walk north. He didn't know where he was going, not precisely, but he knew his targets. He knew their faces, their habits, the way they walked and talked. He had ridden with them, eaten with them, fought alongside them. He would use that knowledge, that intimacy, as a weapon. The desert that had almost killed him was now his ally. It had taught him hardship, stripped him of his illusions, and shown him the brutal reality of the world Thorn had created. He would embrace it. He would become a part of its harsh and forgiving nature. The transformation that had begun in the dark of the mine was now complete. Elias Vance was dead. In his place walked a hunter, a ghost fueled by a righteous vow, his long, lonely trail leading not towards salvation, but towards a deliberate and methodical damnation for the men who had betrayed the star. Time on the frontier was measured not in the turning of calendar pages, but in the changing of seasons, the length of a man's beard, and the depth of the lines on his face. For Eli, the next 2 years were a blur of scorching summers and biting winters, a relentless period of unlearning and relearning, of stripping himself down to his core and rebuilding himself into something new, something lethal. He vanished from the world of men, melting into the vast and tamed wilderness of the West. His first teacher was the silence. He spent months in the Dragun Mountains, a rugged, isolated range that had long been a stronghold of the Kirikahue Apache. He had fought the Apache as a ranger, but he had always respected them, their cunning, their deep understanding of the land, their ability to be unseen until the moment of the strike. Now, he sought not to fight them, but to learn their ways. He watched from a distance, a ghost observing ghosts. He saw how they moved, placing each footfall with deliberate care, how they used the play of light and shadow to their advantage, how they could read the landscape like a written page. He stopped walking like a ranger, confident, steady stride of a man who represented the law. He learned to move like a predator, with a fluid, silent grace, his body low, his senses alive to every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf. He practiced for hours, moving through a dry, leaf-strewn creek bed without making a sound, a feat that at first seemed impossible. Slowly, painfully, he mastered it. His next teacher was hunger. He learned to hunt not with the thunder of a rifle, but with the patience of a snare and the swiftness of a thrown knife. He learned which roots were edible, which berries were poison, how to find water where none seemed to exist. He grew gaunt, his body shedding any softness it once had, becoming a corded bundle of muscle and sinew. The desert and the mountains were his forge, and they were burning away every last vestige of the man who had relied on a steady supply line and the company of others. Solitude became his armor. His skills with firearms, already formidable, were honed to a razor's edge. He wasn't just a fast draw anymore, he became a master of the calculated shot. He spent a winter snowed in a high mountain cabin, left abandoned by a long-dead prospector. With the ammunition he had scavenged and carefully rationed, he practiced relentlessly. He didn't practice speed, he practiced precision. He would set up targets at impossible distance, a pinnacone on a branch 200 yards away, a playing card tossed into the wind. He learned to read the wind, to account for the drop of the bullet over distance, to control his breathing until his heartbeat was a slow, steady drum. His .73 Winchester, once a tool of law enforcement, became an instrument of assassination. He learned to shoot from unconventional positions, from the branch of a tree, from a narrow rock ledge, from the back of a moving horse. He became a marksman of terrifying skill. But his greatest transformation was internal. The white-hot rage that had fueled his initial escape cooled into a cold, hard certainty. His mission was no longer a burning fever but the very blood in his veins. He spent the long, silent nights staring into the embers of his small, smokeless fires, recalling the faces of the men he hunted. He dissected their personalities, their strengths, their weaknesses. Deacon Croft's false piety, Corrigan's brutish greed, Jed's. He still stumbled on Jed, the pain is sharp, fresh stab every time. But he forced himself to remember Jed's betrayal, to use that pain as a whetstone to sharpen his resolve. He would not allow sentiment to dull his edge. During this time of self-imposed exile, he began to hear whispers. He would venture into small, dusty towns on the edge of civilization only when necessary, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat and the growth of a dark beard, to trade a few pelts for salt, coffee, or ammunition. In the dim light of a trading post or the quiet corner of a saloon, he would listen. The stories were always the same. A new group of regulators, wearing the silver star of the Rangers, were terrorizing the territories. Led by a charismatic captain named Thorne, they were no longer lawmen but glorified bandits, extorting protection money from towns, seizing land from ranchers, and crushing anyone who stood in their way under the boot heel of their corrupted authority. The whispers gave him a map, a trail of tears and injustice that showed him the path his enemies were carving across the West. But the people also spoke of something else. They spoke of a phantom, a whisper of retribution that moved in the shadows. A corrupt deputy found dead in an alley, a single, polished rifle cartridge left on his chest. A wagon full of Thorne's ill-gotten loot overturned, its guards vanished, the gold gone. A cruel ranch foreman, known for his loyalty to Thorne, found hanging from a cottonwood tree, his own whip coiled around his neck. They had no name for this avenger at first. But then a pattern emerged. The justice was always swift, silent, and aimed at the agents of Thorne's new empire. One day, in a dusty cantina deep in New Mexico territory, Eli overheard an old vaquero talking to a group of frightened townsfolk. "They say," the old man said, his voice low and reverent, "that it is the Shadow Ranger. They say he was one of Thorne's own, a man they betrayed and left for dead. Now he haunts them. He does not speak. He does not show his face. He is just a shadow, and then there is justice." Eli listened from his corner, his face impassive, but the name resonated within him. He hadn't sought a title, but the world had given him one. Shadow Ranger. It fit. He was a shadow of his former self, and he moved in the shadows of the world. He accepted the name, not with pride, but with a grim sense of finality. It was his brand, his identity in this new life. His transformation was complete. The intelligent, respected Sergeant Elias Vance was a ghost, a memory. In his place stood the Shadow Ranger, a legend born of whispers and fear. He was no longer just a man seeking revenge. He had become an idea, a symbol of hope for the oppressed and a promise of a bloody end for the corrupt. He had honed his body into a weapon, his mind into a trap, and his soul into a single, unyielding point of purpose. The period of forging was over. The time for hunting had come. He left the cantina, melting back into the twilight from which he had come, leaving behind a few coins on the table and a growing legend in his wake. His targets had grown rich and powerful, but they had also grown complacent. They would not be expecting the ghost of the man they had created. The town of Redemption was a liar. Its name, painted on a faded sign full of bullet holes, promised salvation, but the dusty streets and the hard-bitten faces of its inhabitants offered only damnation. It was a border town, a haven for smugglers, gun runners, and those who had worn out their welcome in more civilized parts of the world. And for the past year, it had been the personal kingdom of Sheriff Travis Miller. Eli remembered Miller. He had been a ranger of middling skill but boundless ambition, a man who would always laugh loudest at the captain's jokes and volunteer first for the least dangerous assignments. He had a weak chin and eyes that shifted away when you held his gaze for too long. He was one of the men who had stood with Thorne in the mine, his face a mask of greedy excitement. Eli had learned from the whispers that Miller had used his share of the blood gold to buy the loyalty of Redemption's council and the sheriff's badge that was now pinned to his chest. He ruled the town not with law, but with fear and a cadre of brutal, hand-picked deputies. He was a small man playing at being a king, and his arrogance would be his undoing. He would be the first. Eli didn't ride into Redemption. He seeped into it, arriving after midnight on a moonless night, a phantom on foot leading a horse as dark as his purpose. He stabled the horse in a dilapidated livery at the edge of town and melted into the shadows of the alleys. For 3 days, he became part of the town's squalor. He was a nameless drifter sleeping in a hayloft, a silent observer in the corner of the noisiest saloon, a ghost watching from the rooftops. He learned Miller's routine, which was as predictable as the sunrise. The sheriff spent his mornings collecting his taxes from the local merchants, his afternoons holding court in the saloon with his thuggish deputies, and his nights in the company of a saloon girl in the room above the cantina. He was a creature of habit, insulated by the fear he inspired and the guns he had hired. He never walked alone, always surrounded by at least 2 of his men. A direct confrontation would be foolish. Eli had no intention of being foolish. His vengeance would be a work of art, a masterpiece of fear and precision. On the 4th night, the wind picked up, howling through the dusty streets and rattling the loose shutters of the buildings. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick with the smell of rain and ozone. It was the perfect night. Allie's first move was not against Miller, but against his support. 2 of Miller's deputies were playing a lazy game of cards in the sheriff's office. From his vantage point on the roof of the general store opposite, Eli watched them through the grimy window. He had spent the afternoon preparing, loosening a heavy wooden sign above the office door, rigging it with a rope that led back to his perch. When one of the deputies stepped outside for a smoke, Eli released the rope. The heavy sign swung down with a sickening thud, catching the man squarely in the head and shoulders, crumpling him to the ground in a silent heap. The second deputy, hearing the noise, rushed to the door. As he leaned over his fallen comrade, a single, silent arrow, fletched with a dark crow's feather and fired from a bow Eli had acquired from a Ute trader, sprouted from his throat. He gurgled once and fell. Eli had chosen the bow and arrow for this part of his plan for its silence. He wanted Miller isolated, not alerted by the sound of gunfire. His next target was the pair of deputies stationed at either end of the main street. Using the rising wind as cover, Eli moved across the rooftops with the silence of a hunting cat. He descended a rain barrel into a dark alley behind the first man, his bowie knife in hand. The kill was swift, brutal, and silent. He repeated the process with the second man, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows, a brief, muffled struggle, and then nothing but the sound of the wind. 4 of Miller's 6 deputies were now out of the fight, and the sheriff knew nothing. Now, it was Miller's turn. Eli knew he was in the saloon, deep in his cups. Allie's plan was not to confront him there, but to draw him out, to make him afraid. He circled around to the livery stable, where Miller kept his prized possession, a magnificent black stallion he had bought with his stolen gold. Working quickly, Eli used his knife to cut the saddle cinches nearly all the way through, leaving just a few threads intact enough to hold for a little while, but not under any strain. Then, he opened the stable doors and slapped the horse on the rump, sending it, and the other horses galloping out into the street in a panic. The sound of a dozen stampeding horses brought the saloon to life. Men poured out into the street, Miller among them, his face flushed with whiskey and anger. "My horse," he roared, seeing his stallion disappearing down the street. "Find my horse." His remaining 2 deputies, bleary-eyed and confused, started to run after the animals. This was the moment Eli had been waiting for. From his hiding spot in a darkened doorway, he fired his Winchester. He didn't aim for the deputies. He aimed for the dust at their feet, once, twice. The shots, combined with the howling wind and the chaos of the loose horses, sent the two men scrambling for cover, thinking they were under a full-blown attack. They abandoned their sheriff, just as Eli knew they would. Their loyalty was bought with coin, not forged in battle. Miller was alone, standing in the middle of the street, his hand on his holstered pistol, his eyes wide with a mixture of drunken rage and dawning fear. "Who's out there?" he yelled, his voice strained. "Show yourself." Eli didn't answer. He let the wind speak for him. He let the shadows grow longer. He let the fear ferment in Miller's gut. He fired again, this time shattering the main lantern hanging over the saloon entrance, plunging the street into near-total darkness, lit only by the occasional flash of distant lightning. Miller panicked. He ran for the sheriff's office, seeking the safety of its thick adobe walls. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and finally burst inside, slamming and barring the door behind him. He was breathing heavily, his back against the door, his gun drawn. He felt a moment of relief. He was safe. Then, a match scraped against a surface inside the room. A small flame bloomed, illuminating the calm, cold face of Elias Vance, sitting in the sheriff's own chair, his feet propped up on the desk next to the body of the deputy he had killed with the arrow. Miller's face went white, the blood draining from it. He stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. "Vance," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. You're dead." Reports were exaggerated, Eli said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp he barely recognized as his own. He slowly lowered his feet from the desk, the scrape of his boots on the wood unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Thorne said you turned," Miller stammered, raising his pistol with a trembling hand. "He said you made a deal with the coyotes." "Thorne is a liar. And you are a thief and a murderer," Eli stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "You stood by and watched good men die. You helped murder women and children for a chest of gold. Now your time to pay has come." "I'll kill you," Miller shrieked, a cornered rat finding a last burst of courage. He fired his pistol, the shot deafening in the small office. But his hand was shaking, and the bullet went wide, shattering a whiskey bottle on the shelf behind Eli. Eli hadn't moved. The match had burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it, plunging the room back into darkness just as Miller fired. In the same instant, Eli kicked the chair back and dove to the side. The second shot from Miller's gun tore through the spot where he had been a second before. Before Miller could fire a third time, Eli was on him. He moved through the darkness with a predator's certainty, crashing into the sheriff, his hand seizing Miller's wrist and twisting it viciously. Bones snapped, and the gun clattered to the floor. Miller screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and terror. Eli slammed him back against the wall, his other hand gripping the front of Miller's shirt. "You're not worth a bullet," Eli growled, his face inches from Miller's. He dragged the whimpering, terrified man out the back door of the office and into the alley, just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He hauled him toward the livery, where one of the stampeded horses, a nervous-looking mare, had been cornered. With ruthless efficiency, Eli threw Miller onto the mare's back, tying his hands to the saddle horn. "Where are you taking me?" Miller sobbed. "Please, Vance. I'll give you the gold. All of it." Eli ignored him. He slapped the mare into a gallop, leaping onto his own horse and riding out of redemption, leaving the town to its chaos and its fear. He rode hard, dragging the disgraced sheriff behind him, the storm breaking around them in a torrent of wind and rain. He stopped miles out of town, at the base of a lonely butte that stood like a monument to desolation. He cut Miller free and threw him to the muddy ground. "This is for Jed Stone," Eli said, his voice cold as the rain. "This is for Billy Cobb. And this is for the badge you disgraced." He didn't kill him with a gun or a knife. That would have been too quick, too merciful. He simply took the man's boots, his gun, and his canteen, and left him there. He was 50 miles from the nearest sign of civilization, with a broken wrist and nothing but the clothes on his back. The desert would be his judge and his executioner. It was a fate far crueler than a quick bullet. As Eli rode away, Miller's pathetic pleas were swallowed by the storm. He did not look back. He rode east, toward the rising sun that was hidden behind the storm clouds. One was down. Many more were to come. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, notched piece of wood. He ran his thumb over the single notch he had carved. He thought of the look on Miller's face when he had seen him, the look of a man seeing a ghost. The legend of the Shadow Ranger was no longer just a whisper. It was real, and it had just begun to claim its due. On the dead sheriff's desk, back in Redemption, sat a single, polished Ranger issue .45-70 cartridge, gleaming in the first light of dawn. A message. A promise. The trail of Deacon Croft led Eli high into the San Andres Mountains, a formidable spine of jagged rock and deep, shadowed canyons. The whispers had been consistent. Croft, the pious-faced killer, had used his share of the gold to resurrect a played-out silver mine, aptly named the Penitent Man. He wasn't mining for silver, however. He was mining the lives of men. He had built a fortified encampment around the mine, and using a combination of false promises and brute force, he had lured in dozens of desperate laborers, many of them poor immigrants, and turned them into slaves. He worked them from sunup to sundown, guarded by a small army of hired guns, men every bit as ruthless as their employer. Croft, the man who had always carried a Bible in his saddlebag, had built his own private hell on earth. For a week, Eli lived in the high ridges above the canyon, a ghost in the pinyon and juniper. He watched the camp with a small spyglass, his patience as vast and unmoving as the mountains themselves. He observed the rhythms of the place, the changing of the guards, the blasting schedules in the mine, the route of the weekly supply wagon, and the brutal treatment of the workers. He saw Deacon Croft moving through the camp, his Bible often in hand, sometimes stopping to deliver a fire and brimstone sermon to his exhausted captives about the virtues of hard labor. His hypocrisy a stench that Eli could smell even from a mile away. This was a fortress, far more formidable than Miller's dusty town. A frontal assault was suicide. Croft's men were dug in, with clear lines of sight down the single, narrow road that led into the canyon. But Eli had no intention of fighting their fight. He would use the canyon itself as his weapon. He was no longer just a ranger, he was an Apache, a predator, and this harsh terrain was his ally. His campaign began not with a bang, but with a whisper of sabotage. Under the cover of a starless night, he shimmied down a sheer cliff face using a rope and a prayer. He moved through the camp like a phantom, his face darkened with soot, his movements as silent as a moth's wing. He loosened the wheels on the ore carts, poured sand into the gears of the main winch that hauled rock from the mine shaft, and contaminated a barrel of drinking water not with poison, but with a potent laxative he had made from desert plants. The next day, the camp was in chaos. Equipment failed, work ground to a halt, and half the guards were occupied with sudden and violent trips to the latrine. Croft was furious, his voice echoing through the canyon as he berated his men for their incompetence. It was the first small crack in his armor of control. 2 nights later, Eli struck again. He located the camp's dynamite cache, a small, heavily guarded shed set away from the main buildings. He didn't try to assault it directly. Instead, he spent the day high on the cliff face above it, painstakingly loosening a massive boulder, using a small pick and his bowie knife to chip away at the supporting rock until it was held by a thread. After dark, using his rope, he positioned himself near the shed and waited. When the 2 guards were at their most complacent, deep in conversation, he threw a small rock far to their right. As they turned to investigate the sound, Eli gave a mighty heave on the rope connected to the trigger stone he had set. The boulder tore loose with a deafening groan, crashing down the cliffside. It missed the sheet as Eli had intended, but the impact of a multi-ton rock hitting the ground was like an earthquake. It shattered the shed's foundation, sending boxes of dynamite tumbling, and triggered a massive rock slide that completely buried the narrow road leading into the canyon. Croft's fortress was now his prison. The supply wagon due the next day would not be arriving. Fear began to seep into the camp. The men were on edge, firing at shadows. They knew this wasn't bad luck. They were being hunted. Croft, enraged and paranoid, doubled the guards, ordering them to shoot anything that moved. It was during his surveillance that Eli saw her. Her name, he would later learn, was Sophia. She was young, barely 20, with eyes that held a defiant fire amidst the exhaustion and despair that marked the faces of the other workers. She was the daughter of one of the miners, a man named Mateo who had been savagely beaten by Croft's foreman for trying to demand better rations. Eli watched as Sophia tended to her father's wounds, her movements gentle but her expression one of cold fury. He saw her one evening, slipping away from the workers' hovels and making her way to a secluded spot near an old, dried-up spring. She was meeting summoning a young guard, no older than herself. Eli raised his rifle, centering the guard in his sights, but he hesitated. Their conversation wasn't that of an informer and her master, but of two people in a desperate situation. He crept closer, moving through the underbrush until he could hear their whispered words. The young guard, barely a man, was slipping her a piece of bread and a small skin of clean water. He spoke of his own regret, of how he had been hired to guard a mine, not to be a prison guard for a tyrant. They were planning to escape. They had a small group: Sophia, her father, the young guard, and two other families. They were planning to make a run for it in 2 days, to try and climb the treacherous eastern wall of the canyon under the cover of darkness. It was a suicidal plan. Croft's men would spot them within minutes. Eli felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a conflict. His mission was singular: to kill Deacon Croft and his men. Exposing himself to help these people would be a massive risk. It could compromise his entire operation. It was a distraction from his vow. The cold, hard hunter he had become argued for letting events unfold, for using their escape attempt as a diversion for his own final assault. But then he looked at Sophia's determined face, and he saw the ghost of the man he used to be. The man who had worn the badge not for vengeance, but for the protection of the innocent. He thought of the family at the homestead, the ones he had been too late to save. He couldn't be too late again. His vengeance on Croft would be hollow if it was built on the bodies of more innocent people. In that moment, his mission subtly shifted. It wasn't enough to punish the guilty, he also had to protect the innocent. He made his decision. That night, he left a sign for Sophia. He crept near her hovel and drove an arrow into the ground. Tied to it was not a thread, but a small, intricately carved piece of wood, a bird in flight, and a strip of leather with 3 knots tied in it. It was an old Apache signal. A bird in flight meant a desire to communicate. 3 knots meant in 3 hours, at the place where the arrow landed. He waited, hidden in the rocks above the hovel. He saw Sophia emerge, discover the arrow, and after a moment of fear and confusion, understand its meaning. 3 hours later, she arrived at the designated spot, alone and armed with a heavy piece of wood as a club. Eli emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness. Sophia gasped and raised her club, but he held up a hand. "I am not your enemy," he said, his voice a low whisper. "I saw you at the spring. Your plan will fail. The eastern wall is watched." "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. "A friend," he said simply. "They call me the Shadow Ranger." The name, spoken aloud by himself for the first time, felt strange on his tongue. He saw a flicker of recognition, of hope, in her eyes. The legend had reached even this isolated hell. "You are the one," she breathed. "You caused the rock slide." "I did," he confirmed. "And I am going to tear this place apart. But I need you and your people out first. I can create a diversion, a big one. It will draw every guard to the west side of the canyon. I need you to have your people ready to go east, not in 2 days, but tomorrow night. Can you do it?" She stared at him, this phantom from the darkness, and she nodded, a fierce resolve hardening her features. "We will be ready." The next night, as a sliver of moon hung in the sky, Eli put his plan into motion. He had spent the day planting charges of stolen dynamite at key points along the western cliff face, high above the main mine entrance and Croft's personal quarters. His diversion was going to be an avalanche. Just before midnight, as Sophia and her small group of escapees huddled in the darkness on the far side of the camp, Eli set off the first charge. The explosion was immense, a roar of thunder that shook the canyon to its foundations. A river of rock and earth poured down the cliffside, burying a guard tower and part of the foreman's office. As he had predicted, every guard, including Croft himself, rushed to the west side, firing wildly into the darkness, believing they were under a full-scale assault. The chaos was absolute. In that moment, Eli set off the second and third charges in rapid succession, creating more landslides, more confusion, adding to the pandemonium. While the battle raged on the west side, Sophia and her people scrambled up the eastern wall, the young guard leading them through a little-known goat trail. They moved with desperate speed, shielded by the darkness and the all-consuming noise of Ellie's diversion. Eli, his purpose fulfilled, now turned his attention to his true target. While his men were distracted, Deacon Croft had retreated to his office, a sturdy stone building overlooking the chaos. Eli, using a rope, descended the cliff face behind the office, landing silently on its roof. He dropped through a small window into the back room, moving with a deadly grace. He found Croft in the main room, frantically trying to stuff saddlebags with gold coins and stacks of currency, his Bible lying forgotten on the desk. The pious man was revealed for what he was, a common, terrified thief. Leaving so soon, Deacon Ellie's voice was as cold as a tombstone. Croft spun around, his face a mask of pure terror. He clawed for the pistol on his hip, but Eli was too fast. A single shot from Ellie's Colt sent the gun flying from Croft's hand. He stumbled back, his eyes wide, finally recognizing the face of the ghost who had come for him. "Vance," he gasped. "It can't be. God can't help you now, Deacon," Eli said, advancing slowly. "You defiled his name with every breath you took. You built your fortune on the suffering of others. You betrayed your brothers." "It was Thorne," Croft blubbered, backing away until he hit the wall. "It was all his idea. He made us do it." "You had a choice," Eli said, his voice flat. He stopped just feet from the trembling man. "You chose gold over honor. You chose damnation." Eli didn't raise his gun. He simply stood there, a towering figure of judgment. And then he did something Croft didn't expect. He turned and walked to the door, and barring it. What are you doing?" Croft stammered. "I'm not your judge," Eli said, turning back, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "They are." He opened the door. Standing there, drawn by the sounds of the struggle, was a crowd of the miners. They were armed with pickaxes, shovels, and hammers. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies thin, but their eyes held a fire of righteous fury that had been ignited by the explosions and the hope of freedom. At their head stood Mateo, Sophia's father, his arm in a sling, his face a grim mask of resolution. Croft's face fell, his terror complete. He looked from the mob of his victims to Eli. "No, please." Eli simply stepped aside, leaving Croft to face the justice he had so long denied others. He did not stay to watch. He walked out into the chaotic night, the sounds of Croft's screaming and the roar of the mob fading behind him. He had kept his vow, but he had done more. He had liberated the oppressed. He had saved innocent lives. As he climbed back into the high mountains, he saw a small flicker of a signal fire far to the east. It was Sophia, telling him they were safe. He felt a flicker of something warm in his own chest, a feeling he thought had been extinguished forever. The satisfaction of this vengeance was deeper, cleaner than the cold triumph he had felt leaving Miller to the desert. He pulled out his notched piece of wood and carved a second mark. To down. But as he rode on, the memory he carried was not of Deacon Croft's terrified face, but of Sophia's defiant one. The hunt was still his life, but he now knew it had to be about more than just death. It also had to be about life. The echoes in the canyon had taught him that. The name Corrigan was spoken with a different kind of fear. While Miller had been a petty tyrant and Croft a hypocritical slaver, Patrick Patch Corrigan was a brute, a blunt instrument of violence. Eli remembered him as a large, loud man whose fists were often his first and only argument. He was the one who had delivered the final, brutal shotgun blast to a wounded ranger in the many a memory Eli had forced himself to watch in his mind's eye 1,000 times. The trail led Eli to a muddy, fog-shrouded port town on the banks of the Sabine River called Lamentation. It was a place where the law was whatever the man with the most guns said it was. And that man was Corrigan. He had taken his blood money and invested it in controlling the river trade. Every ferry, every flatboat, every shipment of cotton or timber that moved through Lamentation paid a tax to Corrigan. His headquarters was a sprawling, fortified warehouse complex by the docks, and his enforcers were a motley collection of river rats and hired thugs. Eli arrived not as a shadow, but as a potential problem for his enemy. He understood that a man like Corrigan, who ruled by force, would only respect a greater force. So, Eli created one. He spent a week in the swamps and bayous surrounding the town, hunting not men, but Corrigan's supply lines. He used his knowledge of demolitions, learned from his ranger days, to fell trees across the river, blocking Corrigan's boats. He raided a payroll wagon, not to keep the money, but to scatter it to the winds in the poorest part of town, an act that immediately earned him the silent support of the oppressed locals. He created a phantom competitor. Whispers began to circulate of a new operator, a man from the north, who was planning to set up a rival ferry service, one that wouldn't extort its customers. Corrigan, whose greed was matched only by his paranoia, became enraged. He sent his thugs into the swamps to hunt this mysterious rival, but they found nothing but frustration. Eli led them on ghost trails, into snake-infested waters and sucking mud. He picked them off one by one, not always killing, but disarming, humiliating, and leaving them tied to trees with signs around their necks that read, "Property of Patch Corrigan." The psychological toll on Corrigan was immense. His authority was being challenged, his men were being made to look like fools, and his profits were dwindling. He grew more violent, more unpredictable, turning his rage on the townspeople and his own shrinking circle of loyal men. Eli knew the final confrontation had to be on his own terms. He used an old, disgruntled ferryman, whose business Corrigan had stolen, to spread a rumor. The rival was going to meet a potential backer with a bag of gold at an old, abandoned cypress mill deep in the swamp at midnight. It was a trap, and Eli baited it with the one thing Corrigan could not resist, the promise of money and the chance to crush a challenger with his own hands. As expected, Corrigan took the bait, but he wasn't a complete fool. He brought his 6 remaining and most loyal men, moving through the fog-draped swamp with lanterns held high. The old mill was a skeleton of a building, its massive water wheel silent, half swallowed by the murky water. "Show yourself," Corrigan bellowed into the oppressive silence, his voice echoing off the cypress trees. "I know you're here." The only answer was the chirping of crickets and the low hum of mosquitoes. Corrigan's men fanned out, their rifles ready. They were tense, the eerie silence of the swamp getting under their skin. One of the men kicked open the door to the main mill house. As he stepped inside, a tripwire Eli had set near the floor pulled the pin on a bundle of heavy, suspended logs. They swung down like a giant pendulum, crushing the man instantly. Panic erupted. The men began firing wildly into the darkness. From a perch high in the rafters, Eli used his Winchester. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He shot the lanterns one by one, plunging the area into near-total darkness, a darkness he had already mapped in his mind. Corrigan's men were now blind and terrified. Eli became a force of nature. A knife from the shadows silenced one. A garrote from a low-hanging branch claimed another. He moved through the murky water beneath the mill, pulling one man under without a sound. It was brutal, efficient, and terrifying. Soon, only Corrigan was left. He stood alone in the darkness, breathing heavily, turning in circles, his shotgun held at the ready. "Vance, I know it's you, you bastard," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Thorne told us you might have survived. Come out and face me." "I've been facing you all night, Patch." Ellie's voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You just couldn't see me." Eli dropped from the rafters behind Corrigan, landing as softly as a cat in the mud. Corrigan spun, firing his shotgun wildly. The blast tore a hole in the wooden wall, but Eli was already moving. He closed the distance, his hands empty. This was for the man Corrigan had executed. It had to be personal. He tackled Corrigan, and the 2 men crashed into the shallow, muddy water. It was a primal, brutal fight. Corrigan had the size and strength, his powerful hands closing around Ellie's throat. But Eli was a different animal now. He was leaner, harder, fueled by a purpose that Corrigan's simple greed could not match. Eli drove his thumb into Corrigan's eye, forcing the bigger man to roar in pain and release his grip. He slammed Corrigan's head against a submerged log, tasing him. As Corrigan struggled to rise, Eli found what he was looking for in the mute, a heavy iron chain, once used for hauling logs. He wrapped it around Corrigan's neck. The brute fought back with desperate, fading strength, but Ellie's resolve was iron. He pulled the chain tight, his face a grim, emotionless mask in the faint moonlight that filtered through the fog. "This is for every man who wore the star with honor," Eli rasped, the words of final judgment. He held on until Corrigan's struggles ceased. He left him there, half submerged in the mud, a serpent returned to the slime. He walked out of the swamp as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. On the door of Corrigan's main warehouse in town, he left his now signature mark, a single, gleaming point for 5 to 70 cartridge, standing upright on the threshold. 3 down. With his 3 primary lieutenants dead, Marcus Thorne was no longer just a corrupt kingpin. He was a wounded animal. And a wounded animal is the most dangerous. The whispers changed. The name Shadow Ranger was no longer spoken with a sense of hope, but with a hushed awe, as if speaking of a vengeful god. Thorne, Eli knew, would be hunting him now, using all the resources and manpower his stolen authority could command. Thorne was a master strategist, the man who had taught Eli everything he knew about tactics and deception. Eli knew Thorne would anticipate his next move. He would expect Eli to come for him directly. So, Eli did the opposite. He vanished. For months, he went to ground, letting the trail go cold. He knew Thorne's paranoia would be his worst enemy. Every setback, every bit of bad luck would be attributed to the Shadow Ranger. Thorne would see ghosts in every corner, and his empire, built on fear, would begin to rot from within. Ali's intelligence told him Thorne had made the fortified town of Prosperity his capital. He had used the gold to build a new ranger headquarters, a small fortress in the center of town, and had recruited dozens of new rangers, nothing more than hired guns given a badge and the license to enforce Thorne's will. Thorne, however, was cleverer than Eli anticipated. Instead of waiting for an attack, he set a trap, and he baited it with Ellie's own past. A notice went out, distributed by Thorne's rangers, across the territory. It announced that a memorial was to be dedicated in the town of Silver Creek to the brave rangers who fell in the line of duty at Diablo's Maw. It listed the names of the dead, including Jedediah Stone, and it named the man responsible for their deaths, the traitor, Sergeant Elias Vance. Silver Creek. It was the town where Eli and Jed had first been stationed, the place where they had earned their reputations. The notice was a public declaration of war, and a personal invitation. Thorne knew Eli would not be able to let such a desecration of Jed's memory stand. He was using Ellie's honor against him. Eli rode towards Silver Creek with a cold feeling in his gut. He knew it was a trap. The entire town would be crawling with Thorne's men. But he had to go. He owed it to Jed. He arrived not in the town, but in the hills above it, days before the memorial. He watched as Thorne's men filtered in, taking up positions on rooftops, in alleyways, and in the church bell tower. They weren't trying to be subtle. It was a show of force, an open challenge. Eli knew he couldn't fight an army. He had to outthink a general. He had to turn Thorne's trap back on itself. The day of the memorial was bright and clear. The town square was filled with a mix of curious townspeople and grim-faced rangers. A black drape covered a stone monument in the center of the square. Captain Marcus Thorne himself stood on a wooden platform, ready to deliver a eulogy that would be nothing but lies. But Eli was not in the town. He was miles away. The night before, he had ridden to the main telegraph line that connected Prosperity to the wider territory. He cut the line, isolating Thorne from any outside communication. Then, he started a fire. Not a small fire, but a massive brush fire in the dry canyons south of Prosperity, the town Thorne considered his capital. He knew the wind would carry the smoke and the threat directly toward the town. Just as Thorne stepped up to the podium in Silver Creek, a frantic rider, his horse lathered in sweat, galloped into the square. He was one of the men left to guard Prosperity. "Captain Thorne," he screamed, "the canyons are on fire. The whole South Range is burning. It's heading for the town." Thorne's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of uncertainty. He was caught. His main force was here in Silver Creek, miles from his base of operations, which was now under threat. He looked around the square, his eyes scanning the rooftops, searching for the sniper he was sure was there. "It's a trick," one of his lieutenants hissed. "Vance is trying to draw us away." "And what if it's not?" Thorne shot back, his mind racing. "My entire fortune is in that town. The fire could wipe it all out." He was trapped between protecting his assets and springing his trap. Greed won, just as Eli knew it would. "Half of you, ride with me. Now," Thorne commanded. "The rest of you, stay here. Find Vance. I want him dead by the time I get back." Thorne and a large contingent of his men mounted up and rode out of town at a full gallop, leaving a diminished and confused force behind. That was the moment Eli chose to make his presence known. As the remaining rangers in Silver Creek nervously scanned the hills, a series of miscellaneous events started happening. A horse broke free from the stable. A set of barrels rolled down an alleyway. A shot was fired and a window pane broke. These small distractions drew the attention of the rangers, who rushed off in different directions to see what was happening. That's when Eli set off the first set of dynamite charges he had planted during the previous night at the town's entrance, collapsing a rock overhang and blocking the main road. The rangers were now trapped. The real attack came from an unexpected quarter. Eli had spent the previous day talking to the people of Silver Creek, real people, the ones who remembered the real Jed and Eli. He had shown them the truth, and their anger at Thorn's charade was palpable. When the explosion sealed the town, a citizens' militia, armed with hunting rifles and old pistols, emerged from their homes, firing on Thorn's isolated and outnumbered men. The professional rangers were caught completely by surprise, pinned down by a town that had turned against them. Eli, from his vantage point, acted as a sniper, not to kill, but to control the battle. He shot guns out of hands, pinned men behind cover, and protected the townsfolk, ensuring the fight was decisively one-sided. Within an hour, it was over. Thorn's remaining men surrendered, throwing down their guns in the face of the armed citizenry. Eli had won without having to personally kill a single man. He had used Thorn's own strategy against him, turning the community into a weapon. As the townsfolk secured their prisoners, Eli slipped into the now empty town square. He walked to the monument and pulled away the black drape. It was a simple stone obelisk. On it were carved the names of the fallen. He traced his finger over the letters of Jedediah Stone's name. "Rest easy, brother," he whispered. "They remember you for who you were." He left the monument for the town to keep. He took no prisoners, sought no reward. He simply melted back into the hills. The news of the debacle at Silver Creek would spread like wildfire. Thorn had been outmaneuvered, his authority shattered. He would retreat to his last stronghold, a cornered snake ready for a final, desperate strike. And now, Eli knew, the time for games was over. The road ahead led to a final confrontation, to the man who had started it all. The fallout from the Silver Creek trap was catastrophic for Thorn. His reputation as an untouchable strategist was destroyed. Men who had followed him out of fear and greed began to desert, sensing the tide had turned. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, was crumbling. Eli tracked Thorn's retreat. It was a trail of desperation and decay. Thorn and his core group of loyalists, last of the original traitors, retreated high into the unforgiving peaks of the Guadalupe Mountains. They were headed for a place Eli knew from old maps and ranger lore, a played-out mining town called Solitude, which the locals had long ago renamed Damnation Peak. It was the perfect fortress. Accessible by only one treacherous path, the town was perched on a high plateau, surrounded by sheer cliffs on three sides. It was a place where a handful of determined men could hold off an army. It was where Thorn would make his last stand. The journey to Damnation Peak was an ordeal that tested every ounce of Eli's skill and endurance. He was no longer just a hunter, he was a pilgrim on a dark path. He rode through blistering desert flats and navigated winding, narrow canyons where an ambush could wait on every bend. He was a ghost, but he knew Thorn would have sentries posted miles out from the stronghold. He abandoned his horse miles from the mountains, choosing to make the final approach on foot. He moved only at night, using the skills he had honed over the past 2 years, becoming one with the rock and shadow. He felt the cold of the high-altitude air bite into him, a stark contrast to the fire of purpose that burned in his soul. During this long, silent journey, the faces of the men he had killed visited him in his fitful sleep. Miller, Croft, Corrigan. He felt no remorse for their deaths, but he felt the weight of them. Each man he had put in the ground had chipped away another piece of Elias Vance, the men who had sworn to uphold the law, not to become a one-man judge and jury. He was close to the end, but he wondered what would be left of him when it was all over. Would he be able to stop? Was there any trail back from Damnation Peak? His break came from an old prospector he found living in a secluded shack, a man the world had forgotten. The old man, withered and half-mad from solitude, initially met Eli with the barrel of a shotgun. But Eli wasn't a threat, he was a listener. He shared his coffee and his jerky, and listened to the old man's stories. In return, the prospector told him of a secret way up to the plateau, an old, forgotten goat trail, a treacherous and nearly vertical climb up the back door of Damnation Peak. A route no sane man would attempt. It was perfect. As Eli prepared for the final ascent, a fierce, early winter storm rolled in, blanketing the high peaks in snow and ice. It was a blessing and a curse. The storm would cover his approach, the howling wind masking any sound he made. But it also made the climb infinitely more dangerous. A single slip on the icy rock would mean a silent death in the canyons below. The climb took him an entire night. It was a vertical struggle against the mountain, the wind, and his own exhaustion. His fingers, raw and bleeding, clung to tiny handholds. The weight of his rifle and gear was a constant, pulling drag. He was guided only by the old prospector's crude map and an unyielding will. He reached the edge of the plateau just before dawn. The storm was breaking, and the first rays of sunlight reflected off a world of pristine white snow. Below him lay the ghost town of Damnation Peak. It was a collection of skeletal buildings, half buried in snow, silent and still. Smoke curled from the chimney of only one building, the large, stone-walled saloon, Thorne's command post. Eli had breached the fortress. He was inside the Devil's Lair. He took shelter in an abandoned assayer's office, his body numb with cold, and began his final watch. He counted Thorne's men. There were 10, including Thorne himself. The last of the traitors, cornered and with nothing left to lose. He cleaned his weapons, his movements slow and deliberate. He ate the last of his food. He looked at the bowie knife on his belt, at the tarnished ranger star still tied to its hilt. This was it, the end of the trail. He had been forged in the desert, tested in the canyons, and now he faced his final crucible on a snow-covered mountain. The Shadow Ranger had come to collect the devil's due. The day was unnaturally bright, the new snow casting a blinding glare across the ghost town. The air was thin and bitingly cold. A profound silence hung over Damnation Peak, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the derelict buildings. It was a silence that felt like a held breath. Eli did not launch an immediate assault. He let the silence and the isolation work on the nerves of Thorne's men. He was a ghost in their midst, and he wanted them to feel it before they saw it. He moved from building to building, a gray phantom against the snow, circling the saloon, learning the placement of the sentries, observing the patterns of his prey. His attack began with a single, perfect shot. From the second story of the old hotel, he aimed his Winchester at the rope holding up the massive saloon sign. The bullet severed the rope, and the heavy wooden sign crashed down onto the sentry standing beneath it, killing him without a sound. Before the others could react, Eli was already moving. He slipped out the back of the hotel and circled to the livery stable. 2 of Thorne's men were inside, nervously tending to the horses. They never heard him enter. He used his knife, his movements swift and silent, to moor down. The bodies were discovered minutes later. A shout of alarm echoed through the silent town. Thorne's remaining 6 men burst from the saloon, guns drawn, their faces pale with fear. They spread out, taking cover behind snowdrifts and abandoned wagons, their eyes scanning the empty buildings. This was what Eli wanted. He had separated them. Now, he hunted them. From the bell tower of the town's crumbling church, he fired again. A man who had taken cover behind a water trough fell, a neat hole in his forehead. The others fired wildly at the tower, their bullets splintering the old wood. But Eli was already gone, rappelling down the far side on his rope. He moved through a network of connecting cellars he had discovered earlier, emerging in the general store, directly behind another of Thorne's men. The fight was short and brutal. For down, only Thorne and 2 of his most trusted guards remained. They had retreated back into the stone saloon, the most defensible position. They were trapped, and they knew it. Eli didn't go in. He waited. He let the minutes stretch into an hour. He let the cold and the fear gnaw at them. Finally, he acted. He lobbed a stick of dynamite, not at the saloon itself, but at the snow-laden cliff face directly above it. The explosion was deafening, and it triggered a small avalanche. A torrent of snow and rock cascaded down, completely burying the back half of the saloon, collapsing the roof and blocking any escape. Then, from the street, Ollie's voice rang out, cold and clear. "Thorne, it's over. Send your men out. This is between you and me." There was a long silence from within the ruined saloon. Then, the front doors creaked open. The 2 guards came out, their hands raised high. They were terrified, beaten. They had no more fight left in them. "Drop your guns and walk out of town," Eli commanded from his cover behind the assayer's office. "Don't look back." The men did as they were told, stumbling through the deep snow, their figures shrinking into the distance. Eli let them go. His quarrel was not with them. The saloon door swung in the wind. And then, he appeared. Captain Marcus Thorne stepped out into the blinding sunlight. He looked older, his face haggard, but he still held himself with a soldier's bearing. He was wearing his old ranger coat, the silver star still pinned to it. He held a Colt revolver in his hand. "Elias," Thorne said, his voice carrying in the thin air. "I knew you'd come. I trained you to well. You trained me to believe in honor." "Marcus," Eli said, stepping out from behind the building. He stood in the middle of the street, 100 feet from his former captain. "You taught me the meaning of the star, and then you spat on it. Honor doesn't fill a man's belly or buy him respect," Thorne sneered. "The world is run by men who take what they want. I simply took what was owed to me, to all of us. I built an empire. You built a graveyard," Eli countered, his voice low and dangerous. "You murdered Jed. You murdered good men for gold." "Jed was a fool," Thorne roared, his composure finally cracking. "He was a Boy Scout in a world of wolves. I gave you a chance to be a wolf, Elias. We could have ruled this whole territory together. I'd rather be a dead Boy Scout than a live wolf like you," Eli said, his hand hovering over the butt of his peacemaker. The wind died down. The world seemed to stop. It was the classic standoff, the final, terrible stillness before the storm. Two men, once teacher and student, once brothers in arms, now stood as mortal enemies in a town that God had forgotten. They looked at each other across the snow-swept street. In Thorne's eyes, Eli saw a flicker of the man he used to be the strong, confident leader, no twisted by greed and paranoia. In Ellie's eyes, Thorne saw an implacable force of nature, a ghost forged from his own betrayal. "It ends here, Marcus," Eli said softly. "Only for one of us," Thorne replied. Their hands moved at the same instant, a blur of motion. Two shots rang out as one, the sound cracking through the cold air, echoing off the silent peaks. Eli felt a searing pain tear through his left shoulder, spinning him around. He fell to one knee, his arm useless. But his shot had been true. Marcus Thorne stood frozen for a moment, a look of shocked surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of the silver star on his chest. He looked down at it, then back up at Eli. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He staggered backward, his legs giving out, and collapsed into the snow, his dead eyes staring up at the empty blue sky. It was over. Eli slowly got to his feet, clutching his wounded shoulder. He walked to where Thorne lay, the snow around him stained crimson. He looked down at the man who had been his mentor, his hero, his greatest enemy. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, hollow emptiness. He reached down and pinned the blood-stained star from Thorne's coat. He looked at it, then at the tarnished one on his own knife. He had done it. His vow was fulfilled. Every last traitor had paid the price. He stood alone in the silence of Damnation Peak, the wind whispering around him, wondering if he had just killed Marcus Thorne, or if he had killed the last piece of himself. The journey down from Damnation Peak was a fugue of pain and exhaustion. Eli, weak from blood loss, navigated the treacherous mountain pass in a daze, driven by a primal instinct to simply keep moving. He found the old prospector, who, without a word, helped him bind his wound and gave him a fresh horse. Eli offered him a gold coin he'd found on Thorne's body, but the old man waved it away. "Justice is its own payment, son," was all he said. Eli rode away, not toward any town or settlement, but into the vast, open spaces of the West. He had no destination. His purpose, the single, burning star that had guided him for 2 years, was extinguished. He was adrift. He rode for weeks, letting the land heal him. The physical wound in his shoulder slowly closed, but the wound in his soul remained. The emptiness he felt in the ghost town did not leave him. He had thought vengeance would bring him peace, a sense of justice restored. Instead, it had left him with nothing but ghosts and the taste of ash. He had won his war, but he realized now that he had lost himself in the fighting of it. One evening, sitting by a small campfire under a sky littered with 1,000,000 stars, he took out the 2 ranger badges, his own, tarnished and tied to a killing knife, and Thorne's, stained with blood and betrayal. They represented the 2 paths he had walked, the path of honor and the path of vengeance. He looked at them for a long time, the firelight glinting off the silver. He had become what he'd had to be to survive and to fulfill his vow, but he did not have to remain that man. With a final, decisive movement, He took the two badges and buried them together under a flat river stone. He was burying Elias Vance, the Honorable Ranger, and the Shadow Ranger, the cold-hearted killer. He would be neither from this day forward. He rode on. The legend, however, had a life of its own. The story of the fall of Thorne's empire spread across the territories. They spoke of how his lieutenants had been picked off one by one, how his army had been dismantled by a single, unseen force. They spoke of a ghost, an avenger who had come to collect a debt of blood. They called him the Shadow Ranger. His story became a campfire tale, a warning to corrupt lawmen, and a flicker of hope for the oppressed. They said he had vanished after his work was done, that he had ridden into the sunset, his vengeance complete. A year later, in a small, struggling settlement in the Arizona Territory, a town was being choked by a ruthless cattle baron who had bought the local sheriff and was driving ranchers off their land. The people were desperate, their prayers for help unanswered. One evening, a stranger rode into town. He was quiet, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much and a leanness that spoke of hard miles. He didn't wear a badge, and he carried no fancy guns. He took a job as a hired hand on one of the ranches being threatened, his name given simply as Eli. He worked hard, spoke little, and watched everything. When the cattle baron's thugs rode out to burn a homesteader's cabin, they found their path blocked by a lone, silent figure. The fight was short and brutally efficient. The stranger didn't kill them, but he left them broken, bruised, and terrified. Word spread. The quiet hired hand was more than he seemed. When the bought-off sheriff came to arrest him, the stranger disarmed him and ran him out of town, not with a bullet, but with a cold, steady gaze that promised a violence the sheriff wanted no part of. He organized the ranchers, taught them how to defend their land, how to stand together. He was not a killer, he was a leader, a protector. One night, the cattle baron's daughter, a young woman who despised her father's cruelty, came to the stranger's camp. "Who are you?" she asked. "The people are starting to whisper. They say you are him, the Shadow Ranger." The man looked up from the fire, his face etched in shadow and light. "That was a man who was owed a debt," he said, his voice quiet. "His debt is paid. I'm just a man passing through." He eventually helped the townspeople win their fight, restoring a fragile peace to the valley. And then, just as quietly as he had arrived, he rode on. He left behind a town that had found its courage and a growing question. The legend of the Shadow Ranger grew, but it changed. It was no longer just a tale of bloody vengeance. It became a story of a wandering protector, a nameless, faceless man who would appear when the law failed and good people needed a champion. They said he would fight for the helpless, that he would restore the balance, and his only calling card was the justice he left in his wake. And so, on a distant ridge, a lone rider might be seen, his silhouette dark against the setting sun. He looks down at the lights of a distant town, at the ranches and homesteads scattered across the land. He is no longer driven by hatred, no longer a ghost haunted by his past. He is a man who has found a new purpose on the endless trail, not to avenge the dead, but to protect the living. The war for his soul was over. The man, Elias Vance, had finally found a way home.